Welcome to our TAE 40116 support session, and today we're going to be covering the theoretical concepts that sit behind this wonderful topic of assessment in the vocational education sector. So we're specifically going to be looking at the requirements around planning assessment activities and processes, and then actually assessing competence once you've prepared an assessment tool for use with vet candidates. If we have a look at that first unit around planning assessment activities and processes, you can see that the content that it requires you to be competent in relates to determining how you will approach your assessment. So once you have a student who is completed their learning or their training activities, how do you know that they can actually demonstrate their competence around the topic that you've taught them? So you always have to pre-plan what that assessment approach is going to be like, and it will be different perhaps for different students, subject to things like the existing skills and knowledge they may already hold. They may be doing an assessment-only pathway for RPL, or they may be doing a full assessment approach, and there'll be different types of assessment methods that we'll be discussing today. Then you have to prepare an assessment plan, and that's really drilling into the requirements within a unit of competency around what assessment looks like. We're then going to look for ways to identify modification and contextualization requirements. So the word contextualization is quite an important one within the vet sector, because typically within even an industry, no two workplaces will have the same benchmarks for what they deem competence looks like. So we're going to talk about that concept a bit further, and then we're going to actually put together some assessment instruments which will form part of an assessment tool that you'll then be able to use with a candidate in a workplace environment if you're doing assessment there or in a classroom. The second part to it is then using those assessment tools to conduct your assessment and actually assess competence. So we'll be talking a little bit about what the definition of competence is and how you know if someone is competent, and how it's a very important legal process, and all the evidence that you collect in the process of assessing someone as being competent is very, very important to make sure that good record keeping is kept and things like that. So the content coverage is going to be about preparing for assessing a student, how you gather that quality evidence, how you support the candidate to make sure the process works well for both the candidate and the assessor, how you make that assessment decision, and then the recording and reporting after you've completed the actual assessment activity itself. So I guess we might start with a few definitions, really to get clear in our mind what we are talking about when some of this terminology is used. I think in the first video that we had around the design unit, we talked about the glossary that's available within the Vet Knowledge Bank. So do refer back to that if any concepts or topics come up through this particular part of your TAE, where you may want to refresh yourself about what some of these definitions are. So according to the standards for registered training organisations, so that's the RTO law that must be abided by anyone who's an accredited registered training organisation, the definition there states that assessment is the process of firstly collecting evidence, secondly making judgments on whether the competency has been achieved. And I think if we unpack that statement a little bit, it'll kind of break down what our session on assessment is going to be covering. So the word evidence is really anything physical that you can slap on the desk after you finish the assessment process to say, I believe this person is competent because of this evidence. And it really is a legal evidence-based process. So it's not good enough for someone to tell you how competent they are. They must be able to demonstrate and show you, and you must collect solid, robust evidence that supports your decision about what that competency, whether that competency standard has been met. So we do have to make sure that we've got very, very clear expectations about what competency looks like. Again, it says confirming that an individual can perform to the standard required in the workplace as specified in the training package or a vocational education vet accredited course, and we went through the difference between those two sorts of training products in our first session when we're designing training. The concept of competency-based assessment is very specific in a lot of cases to the vet education system, and it's about making sure that we are really doing whatever we can to design assessment tools that confirm for us as the assessor, and obviously the workplace employer or supervisor, that the candidate is work ready or job ready. So it's a little bit different to the school system and the university system, which is more preparing people to then go and practice their skills within a workplace. But competency-based assessment is really making sure that we're practicing those skills during the learning process, so that when it comes time to assess if someone is competent, we really know that they can do it. It's not just about knowing the underpinning knowledge or the rules and regulations around a topic. They have to be able to show you that they can do the task. So it's always very vocationally based. And this concept of competency-based assessment, or CBA as we often refer to it, means that we're assessing under 3 different areas. And one is the knowledge. So it is important that someone does understand all the how and why part of a topic when they're going to be performing something in a workplace. So during the assessment part of knowledge, it's about ensuring that the candidate can tell you what they know. And the reason we don't just take assessment on their skills itself, which would be often it's referred to as a bit of a monkey see, monkey do. So you may have come across people in a workplace where they can do something, but they don't really know why they're doing it, or perhaps what can go wrong when they're doing it, or any sort of variations around doing something. They just follow along what somebody else is doing and don't often have that underpinning knowledge, which can lead to better performance and certainly safety for a lot of environments. So the first part is knowledge. The second part then is skill. And this is the biggest part that relates to the vet sector around making sure that people can not just do the skill once in a very fixed or perhaps perfect environment, that they can apply those skills within a real workplace, and they can then do it across what they call different dimensions of competency. So it's not enough just to do the skill in the perfect world. They must be able to do it in environments where things are not perfect, so where contingencies might occur. So if you're teaching someone a particular skill, you should also be teaching them how to cope when things are not perfect. You should also be ensuring that your assessment caters for task management, and that's really being able to do a sequence of skills to complete a full work activity. So if you were teaching someone how to, for example, make a coffee, you wouldn't just assess them on just the one part of, crushing the beans and grinding the beans. You'd assess them on the entire process of starting the coffee making procedure, exactly the same way that it would occur within a hospitality environment, and also to the time expectations. So you couldn't allow an assessment for coffee making to not be real world in terms of the time expectation, for example. So that's a different task management, is to make sure that things are done as the industry would expect. Then we've got job role and environment, and that's often in assessment you may have specific context around the assessment. So that just means the requirements of a particular industry or a particular job role. So if you were teaching first aid, for example, you may have assessment activities that you get your candidate to perform that relates to first aid in a aged care facility, or in an early childhood education facility, or in a hospitality facility. So first aid in all those different job roles or environments may differ. So the sorts of activities you would get someone to do could be different if you were teaching people from those different industries. Not that the unit of competency is any different, but the way the skills are demonstrated to you as the assessor may differ. So that's really our dimensions of competency there. Underneath then is a section called attitude, and that's a terminology given to the other soft skills that support someone being job ready. So it means that people are not just able to tell you what they know and show you what they can do. They can also demonstrate for you that they can perform in a workplace. And some of these core skills for work you may recognise from your own workplace. So it's things like navigating the world of work, so being able to be self-managed in a work environment, interacting with others. So that could be things around communication and being part of a team. Another one is getting the work done. So that could be things like time management or different technologies that may support being able to function in a workplace. So if you picture someone who's been in the school system only, quite often these core skills for work haven't yet been developed sufficiently, that they need to get out and be in a real workplace to understand some of these other soft skills that are part of being a functioning employee in a work environment. Secondary in the foundation skills is what we call the Australian Core Skills Framework. So this is around your language literacy and numeracy requirements to again be job ready in a particular work environment. So those 5 core skills are learning, reading, writing, oral communication and numeracy. So if you have candidates who are coming through your vocational education environment who are learning how to be job ready, you would also need to do some sort of review to make sure that they could cope with any of those skill requirements in the workplace. So that might be things like, can they read safety signs or policies and procedures? Can they communicate at oral communication at an effective level to be able to do a job that involves a lot of connection with the general public or customers? So it's those sorts of additional skills which sometimes are not as well developed in some people as they are in others. So the TAE unit about LLN covers a lot of the content behind how you can help support any learners that you may have in that particular requirement there. So then we come along to looking at other concepts that are important to really understand before you start writing assessment materials. So the first one is context, and we've touched on that a little bit in our prior slide. It's really making sure that your assessment is not vanilla. And by that I mean that you're not just assessing something like communication with some sort of random task that you're getting someone to do, that you are really thinking about the context or the work environment that that particular candidate is going to be working in, and making sure that your assessment reflects examples of specific things that they will then be asked to do when they go to work in their particular workplace. So if you think about the topic of communication, which is quite a general skill that would apply to every workplace, if you're writing an assessment around that, you might put together a role play, for example, and you might have the role play set up to reflect a specific customer interaction that that particular candidate will then be going to be experiencing in the workplace that they're going to work in. So that would differ depending on what that workplace is. So again, if you're talking about aged care versus early childhood education versus hospitality, the different types of communication interactions that you would have will differ. So therefore, your assessment should really reflect the one that's going to be most applicable to that candidate, because that's going to help them become job ready. So context is very important to identify before you start anything around your assessment process. So really have a good feel for who the learner is and what sort of work environment they're aiming for. The next 3 are all looking at what we're aiming for when we write assessment. So assessment is all about meeting a standard. And if you reflect back on school days, for example, you would have had a knowledge standard to meet. So you would have had an exam perhaps on a topic that you were part of in your school work. So you would go through a learning part, and then you would be given a test. And that test is really to identify whether you could meet a particular standard of knowledge around the topic of that subject that you were considering. In the vet sector, we have exactly the same thing, except there are 3 parts to this expectation or goal or description of what competence looks like. So the first standard are those that are listed in the unit of competency. So when we did our design unit, we looked at a unit of competency and we pulled apart what some of the standards might be that would have to be met before you could consider someone as competent. And we'll be going through that a bit further on in this session. The second standard to consider is what industry requires. So if you consider different industry bodies, they will do, or because they're so much a subject matter expert, they will do all the pre-thinking about what does competence look like when it relates to a certain activity within their environment. And the third standard is what the workplace requires as their one best way of doing something. So if you're putting together assessment for a particular employer, just say we use the coffee making example again, you may have a slightly different process in what is the expected way of making coffee depending on the brand that you work for. So if you work for one of the chains, the coffee chains that are out there quite commonly these days, you might have Zarafas or Gloria Jeans or Starbucks or one of those different brands. They all make coffee, of course, and they would all have a coffee, have people who may be doing the unit of competency around coffee making, and there may be industry standards around what a good coffee is. But those individual workplaces may then have their own one best way of making their coffee to their standard. So it's about taking into account all 3 different standards and kind of blending them together and taking the highest of each for the different topics that come up. If we look at that as an example on training.gov, I'll just flip over to a unit of competency. So I think on the screen now you can see the HLT AID 001, which is provide CPR. So if we have a look at those 3 concepts within this unit, let's just scroll down to the sections that relate to standards. So all of this information is contained firstly within our elements and performance criteria. So within every unit of competency, there is a specific area that defines what the outcome is if you're competent. So by the end of this training session, you should be able to respond to an emergency situation, perform CPR procedures, and communicate details of the incident. Then you've got these performance criteria. So this is the level of performance or the standard needed to demonstrate achievement of this particular topic of CPR. So it gives you some more specific outcomes to achieve. So even though your total outcome is that you can respond to an emergency situation, what does that look like in broken down behaviours? So the first part is recognising that you have an emergency situation. Then you've got identifying and assessing to minimise any hazards to self and others. So you've got to check the environment for safety to others. So this whole section on performance criteria is the first part of those standards that we talked about. Then secondly, if we go down to the section on assessment requirements, it will give you these performance evidence requirements and knowledge evidence requirements. So in here it talks about there must be evidence that the candidate has completed the following tasks, and there's some tasks below, in line with state and territory regulations, first aid codes of practice, and the Australian Resus Council guidelines. So when we're talking about industry standards, this is what we're talking about. And they use very generic statements like this within a unit of competency. So it says go find the ARC guidelines to know how many beats per minute should be done as a CPR process, and that can change. So instead of having to change the unit of competency every time something changes with the industry standard or this ARC guidelines in this example, It means that you as the trainer assessor have to stay current with what they are, and you would have to update your assessment process to meet any new or changed workplace procedures or standards. Same thing with state and territory regulations. So there could be legislation that might change around a particular topic. Again, you've got to keep yourself up to date on all of that and make sure that's incorporated so that second standard is met. And then finally, you would base it on the actual context or the industry standard. So I know with some certain organisations, they require this unit to be completed more often than the state and territory regulations. So I think instead of having to do this particular unit of competency, have it refreshed every year, some organisations say every 6 months. So their standard is actually higher than what the industry dictates as best practice because they have a very high risk work environment. So they may put a different additional standard over and above what the industry and the unit of competency requirements are. So it just gives you a bit of something to think about when it comes to these different standards that we are required to meet when we are determining if someone is competent or not. And just in summary, those dimensions of competency, so there was 4 of those. So it's really making sure that when you put your assessment plan together and you picture how you're going to assess someone, that you don't just assess them in a perfect world environment. Because when they get out into the real world environment, it may not be so perfect, and you're potentially setting them up to fail or not be able to cope as well in the real world if you haven't incorporated these additional competency dimensions. So just to refresh on these, the task skill. So that's just making sure that your assessment always includes something where they have to show you they can do a task, not just tell you how to do a task. So you wouldn't have them just present a lecture or something on the topic. You would actually get them to perform a workplace task. And then to make sure that it involves all those extra dimensions, you would then make sure that this task management skills was incorporated. So they must manage a range of tasks to complete the whole job. It's got to be done in the right sequence and the right time frames and everything that matches how it would actually occur in the real world. Then you've got contingency, so that's problem solving around any of the what ifs that can occur in a real world environment, which would be kind of often daily in a lot of workplaces where things don't always go to plan and you have to problem solve. And then making sure that you're meeting any particular workplace standards and expectations specific to that industry or workplace that the candidate's going to be ultimately part of. So it just says competency involves successful work performance and is usually seen as covering those 4 different dimensions of competency. So we've just talked through these different components that make up the assessment standards within a unit of competency. So just in summary, we firstly looked at the elements of performance criteria. So what are the actual outcomes to be demonstrated by someone who's now competent in a unit of competency, and what are the performance criteria that someone has to meet? And I often like to describe these as being, if you think of someone applying for a job, often they'll have selection criteria to meet, which is often stated in a job ad as something like, a successful candidate will be able to meet the following selection criteria. So you must be able to do A, B, and C. So when you're assessing someone, it's exactly the same. So we call it performance criteria, and you've got to list what the A, B, and C is that someone has to be able to give you evidence that they hold those skills and knowledge, no different to if you're applying for a job where it has selection criteria. Then you've got these other sections, performance evidence, knowledge evidence, and assessment conditions, and these are found in the second half of the unit, down the bottom of the unit on training.gov.au, where they actually give you details around how the assessment evidence is to be collected. So it's like giving you a guide around the assessment components. So it will tell you specifically what the skills are that you have to obtain evidence of, and how often you might have to do it, any specific context that you have to do it in. Then there's knowledge evidence. So this is the underpinning theory that might sit beneath the topic and what depth you might have to assess your candidate to. And then assessment conditions are the non-negotiable arrangements around the assessment. And it says here that it specifies the conditions under which evidence for assessment must be gathered, and that can include details around things like particular equipment, materials, contingencies, specifications, physical conditions, etc., etc. So it may well be that some units of competency are not allowed to be assessed in a simulated environment. There may be an assessment condition that says it must be assessed in a real workplace. Or it also has specific assessor requirements. So in some units of competency that I've seen that are more high risk, some things to do with mining and civil construction and things like that, it will often specify that the assessor has a minimum of 5 years industry experience, and that will be very clearly laid out in these assessment conditions. So if we again have a look at that unit of competency that we were in previously, if you have a look at the performance evidence, for example, it says that you must have performed at least 2 minutes of uninterrupted single rescuer CPR with 5 cycles of compressions and ventilations on an adult mannequin, at least, placed on the floor, and that you must also this uninterrupted CPR on an infant. So if you only assessed someone on an adult mannequin and you didn't assess someone on an infant mannequin as part of your assessment process for this CPR unit of competency, then your evidence would not be complete. So you wouldn't be able to deem someone as competent. They have to show you everything in this assessment assessment requirements section of the unit of competency. Then obviously it gives you a whole lot of knowledge requirements. So people must know about the state and territory regulations. They must know about things like the ARC guidelines and safe work practices, etc. And then down the bottom here where it's got assessment conditions, it puts together what are the actual assessment resources that you must have during the assessment process. So again, it talks about the adult and infant mannequins. You must have a defibrillator training device. So again, if your assessment didn't have the defib training device, then it would not be a complete assessment and you couldn't mark someone as competent. And you must have some sort of reporting form related to injury or trauma or illness based on an appropriate workplace incident. So these are the sorts of things that when ASQA will come and audit an RTO, they will check to make sure that all the equipment that's listed in the unit of competency is always available to be used during the assessment process. And it also is listed within the training and assessment strategy that's there before that we've covered previously. Additionally, it says that apart from the standard requirements of an assessor for this unit, having their TAE, etc., they must also hold a first aid certificate at HLT AID 003 or higher. So if you just held the 001 CPR qualification or certificate, you would not be eligible to be an assessor for this particular unit of competency. So you would have to hold that 003 version or higher to be deemed able to assess this particular unit for training and assessment. Okay, so moving on, let's have a look at another definition. So according to the standards for RTOs, there's a terminology around assessment system. And the system is really just the combination of everything that is part of the process of conducting assessment. And it states here it's a coordinated set of documented policies and procedures, which includes your assessment materials, your tools, your instructions, and again, that will also include things like your equipment and any resources you need that ensure assessments are consistent and they are based on, and these are two very important theoretical concepts that we'll be going through in detail shortly. They're based on the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence. So those two concepts are part of the vet sector and they're written into the standards for registered training organisations. So they are required by law for all assessment practice within the vet sector around making sure that assessment is conducted to a high quality standard. So we'll be going through those two concepts shortly. There's also some definitions around the collection type, so the assessment collection type. And there's three that are commonly referred to. That's direct evidence, indirect evidence, and supplementary evidence. So remember, when we use the term evidence, we mean what is the physical output or physical item that you will collect during the assessment process that will allow you to then make that decision of competent or not yet competent. And you may have multiple forms of evidence for one unit of competency. So direct evidence is where someone like an assessor is involved in the collection of the evidence directly from the candidate. So you might ask someone directly some knowledge questions. You might watch them doing their knowledge test. You might watch them doing a task and completing a task either in a simulated environment or in the actual workplace itself. So the evidence that is produced at the end of that would be something like the knowledge test itself or the observation checklist. And the reason that is the strongest evidence type is that you have eyes on seeing someone actually completing the evidence requirements. So it takes away any questions about authenticity. It certainly confirms that the candidate is very current with their skills and knowledge, and we'll be coming to why that's important shortly. Indirect evidence collection is when you are not present when the evidence is produced, but you can still verify it. So that might be an online knowledge test. So you give someone access to an online portal where they go in and they answer some questions, and then you mark from there. You might have a third-party report. So you might ask someone who's a supervisor of the candidate within a workplace to watch someone do a task to industry standard, and they may make some notes on a checklist and provide back to you information that says, yes, I have watched that candidate complete a task and they've performed it to industry standard. Or you may have a candidate submit a video. So they might not be able to complete the assessment in the classroom. They may complete it in their own workplace and just video that and submit that back to you. So indirect is not quite as robust as direct because you're not actually seeing the candidate necessarily doing the actual task itself in front of you. So you just need to make sure that you have some form of cross-checking that it is the candidate's own work as part of that. And that also applies to supplementary evidence, which is additional evidence supporting the main direct and indirect evidence. So that could be a portfolio of items. You might have someone complete a logbook, for example, to say, here's the amount of times that I have performed that task in the last 3 months. And that goes to support their skills are being practiced in the workplace. And you might have a supervisor sign off and supervise them as they're doing those tasks and then sign off that they perform them to a set level. So there are 2 reference documents that are put out by ASQA that support a lot of the background on these topics. Let me just grab them on the screen. So the first one that I'll refer you to is called ASQA's Guide to Developing Assessment Tools, and it will summarise a lot of the content that we're talking about during this session. So it gives you definitions about assessment and how to plan, what the different assessment methods are, how to design to make sure that you're capturing the context correctly and things like that. So certainly I would refer people to read this document thoroughly. There's also another one which is called Using Other Parties to Collect Assessment Evidence, and it's a fact sheet. So on the ASQA website from time to time they will put out these sorts of documents that just give extra guidance around what the expectation is when it comes to any of the requirements of the standards. So this one is about when you're using someone else, so this is indirect evidence by using another party to collect assessment evidence. And it just gives you information about how you can strengthen that process to make sure that it is going to be robust. So again, it gives you definitions around direct, indirect and supplementary, and then it will come down to these principles of assessment and things like that. It also gives you some good examples of when and why you might need to use another party to collect evidence. And quite often it will be a situation where when someone is conducting a work activity with a patient or with someone, there could be some confidentiality or privacy issues. So you might need to use a supervisor who is able to be part of that work task to actually observe someone in the workplace. So if you were a disability carer and you had an observation of a task to be done in the home of a patient while you're doing some daily care activities, you wouldn't necessarily want the assessor there watching that happening, and you might just have a supervisor who can observe that happening at the same time. So there are some guidelines about how to make it more robust and making sure that the evidence is still strong as if it was direct evidence. There's also another form which is called a co-assessment, and that's where the assessor may not necessarily have sufficient industry, currency and competency on the topic, and they work with someone who does. So an example of this might be giving out medication in an aged care facility, because the unit of competency related to that specifies that it must be observed by a registered nurse. So the assessor, whilst they may have a lot of skills and knowledge about the topic of administering medication, they may not necessarily be a registered nurse. So they may do something like a co-assessment with that registered nurse, where they jointly make the judgment about whether competency has been achieved. So the registered nurse doesn't have to have a TAE, but they have to have their registration as a nurse. And the assessor obviously has to have the standard TAE and industry currency and competency. So together they will often work about determining that the candidate is able to be signed off as competent. So again, I'd suggest having a read about this concept of using others to collect evidence, as it's quite an important strategy to be very robust around. And the links for those are down the bottom of the page there, or you can just Google ASCO Guide to Developing Assessment Tools or fact sheet on using other parties to collect evidence. Alrighty, so our assessment tool then, just to refresh, is covering all those requirements needed to make that competency decision. So it will have information about what are the context and conditions of assessment. So remember, the conditions of assessment were found in the unit of competency down the very, very bottom in that assessment requirements section. And the context will be individual to the workplace or the candidate's specific environment that you're going to be helping them confirm job readiness for. It will list what the tasks are that the student is going to complete during the assessment process. So really, really important that there are no surprises during the assessment process, that both the student and the assessor are very clear about what do you have to do to show me that you are competent, and to what standard, what's the benchmark that I need to observe. So how long do you need to take in making that coffee? So any of those sort of specific requirements must be very clear to the student. Then you must have some sort of documentation around how that evidence is to be gathered. So is it going to be done in a classroom simulated environment? Is it going to be gathered in the workplace? Is it going to be conducted once or 5 times? All of this sort of information is what comes together in as part of the assessment tool, and we normally capture that in a document called the assessment plan. And then we have to have some sort of evidence criteria to make sure that if you had, multiple assessors deeming multiple students as competent, that they all know how to judge if someone has met the standard. So when we talk about evidence criteria to make a decision about competence, we're talking about things like a marking guide, and that would be things like model answers for a knowledge test. So if you're asking a question about, what are the top 5 requirements for a particular task, you need to list what those top 5 are, because if you asked the question of 5 different assessors, they may come up with different things that they believe are the top 5 requirements. So you have to have consensus about what the benchmark model answers are going to be. That also applies when you're observing someone in a task situation. So again, you have to really specify what are the behaviours that you want your assessor to confirm the candidate can do. So they have to be very, very clear. Otherwise, if you have it as very generic statements about performed tasks to industry standard, it doesn't give enough information for an assessor to know what the behaviours are that will meet that industry standard. So when we come to showing you the specifics of writing assessment instruments that form part of this assessment tool, we'll be showing you examples of what we mean with that, just so that we get a very consistent outcome of what competence looks like if you're using different assessors and you're using different students in different contexts and environments. It also mentions that the assessment tool, so this is the overall process and all the items that go towards that process, also takes into consideration the administration, recording and reporting requirements, and it also may cover more than one unit of competency, and we call that clustering. So if you've got 2 units of competency that are of a common content and are often performed together in a workplace environment in the real world, you may often find that the assessment is kind of blended together for the 2 units of competency. So you might have 1 unit of competency that says prepare to do a task, and one that says do a task, and one that says review a task. So instead of doing it as 3 separate assessment tools, you might put one assessment tool together that covers all 3 units, that covers the end-to-end task of preparing, doing and reviewing the actual task itself. So we call that holistic assessment, or often referred to as clustering in the industry. So that's the assessment tool. So within the assessment tool, then it will have little individual instruments, which are the pieces of evidence that form the method by which you can determine that someone is competent. So a few more little definitions just to add to the mix here. So these are all assessment types, and that's different to assessment methods. We'll be coming to assessment methods in a minute, but these are assessment types. So if we move right to the bottom one on the list here first, which is norm referenced assessment, this is what most people would be most familiar with if they're not necessarily connected to the vocational education system. So this is when your assessment process results in a score or a grade. So you don't just get a competent, not yet competent outcome. You might get a result that has a percentage score. So you've got 75% out of 100% for this knowledge test. Or it might be a letter, like in the school system, you might get an A on your test or a C on your test, depending on your performance level. In the higher ed system, they will often have things like high distinction, credits, passes. So really all that means is that your result is being compared to others and you're given a rating, basically, and that's what we call norm referenced assessment. And that assessment format is not used in competency-based assessment. So when you're doing assessment writing, for this particular industry, the vet sector, you don't need to put together some sort of a scoring, they call it a rubric, that says, well, if you're getting a high distinction, your performance looks like this, or if you're getting a credit or a pass, it looks like this. Now, that may apply within your industry to certain other forms of assessment. So if you're, say, for example, in a dance industry, and you're doing exams to do with your particular form of dance, they may have norm referenced assessment. So they may have distinctions or high distinctions or credits and things like that, or ABC or some other form of grading. But if it's to do with certificate programs, like any of the certificate 1 through to diploma and advanced diplomas, etc., the result is only ever determined as you've met the standard, yes or no. So you don't have different levels of, well, you met the standard better than somebody else. It's really just, here's the standard, did you meet it, yes or no? So that's what we call criterion referenced assessment. That's the second one on the list here. And that's really just saying that your assessment evidence has been mapped or confirmed to show full coverage of all the unit performance criteria, along with the standards-based assessment, which is the one beneath that, which talks about making sure that you've met whatever the industry benchmark is as well. And often it'll be a work-focused assessment where it's going to have the context of the workplace that you're in used in the assessment process itself. So it might have specific language or forms or particular ways of doing things. So the competency-based assessment is always criterion and standards-based. It will typically have a work focus and it's always evidence-based. So you can't make a competency decision unless you have enough evidence that confirms that the candidate is performing to a job-ready standard. And we've already talked about integrated assessment, where you might put common units together when you're doing the assessment and just produce one assessment tool that may cover more than one unit of competency. Okay, so moving along with our definitions. So this is slightly different to what we just talked about with our evidence types. This is our assessment methods and what the associated assessment evidence is that goes with the different methods. There is kind of unlimited ways of confirming that someone is competent. So this is by no means a complete list, and certainly if you refer to your other reference material or learning materials, you'll probably have lots and lots of other options there around assessment methods. And it really comes down to whoever is writing the assessment tool as to which way they feel is the best pathway to determine that someone is competent. And again, it will come down to the learner. So often, if people already hold existing skills and knowledge, they may be able to show a portfolio. And that could be a collection of their life's work, showing all the different things they've done that support the fact that they can perform to a certain standard with their skills and they have a certain amount of knowledge. The most common assessment methods that are used, particularly for workplace assessment, would be an observation. So the method is observation, and the assessment evidence that is put on the table at the end of the day after you've completed the assessment is what's called an observation checklist. So that's where you've got a list of behaviours that someone, whether it's the assessor itself or a supervisor, third-party observer, is watching someone complete a task and saying, did they complete to the standard that these behaviours are required to show that they have met that competency standard there. So observation can be assessed in real time in the workplace, or it can be simulated off the job. It can, again, be a video we talked about where someone can send in a video and then the assessor just watches the video and ticks off against the observation checklist. Other forms of assessment that are quite common is questioning. So that's typically what's used to confirm that underpinning knowledge has been achieved. So it can be a written test paper as an evidence item. You might have an online test, or you might ask questions verbally. So it's really one that could also be part of things like watching someone conduct an interview or something like that. So it's lots and lots of different ways you can determine someone's knowledge through questioning. And then the other couple of examples on the screen here are product-based methods. So this is where you're asking your candidate to complete a structured activity or some sort of task where they have to produce something. So it could be something, if you're in hospitality, it might be producing a food item where you go away and you make a cake and you bring it in, and then the assessor will check the cake to see whether it's met the requirements. And the assessment evidence would be something like a product marking guide plus the product itself. So that could be something that says, you know, does the cake have all the ingredients been used? Is the cake to a certain height? If it's based on having to rise to a certain level, does it have a certain texture? So all of those characteristics of what would be a correct product that's been produced would be listed on that product marking guide. So it's making sure that there are these benchmarks again that we talked about, all those standards that would have to be achieved to be a satisfactory result with that product itself. And then down the bottom, the last one we've got there is third-party evidence. So that's where someone else is sort of approached to confirm that the knowledge and skills of the candidate are already held, and they may have some questions to answer about the performance of a candidate. Again, I'd refer you to that Ask with Facts sheet about using third-party evidence to assess competence, as it gives a lot of definition there. It's also quite common that people will take an assessment-only pathway, and this is often called recognition of current competency, where someone may have a certificate that they got years and years ago, and because they have been actively working in the industry and therefore using the skills and knowledge and keeping them current, you can give them a direct credit if the unit was equivalent, or you may just need to do a little bit of gap training to make sure that they are still current to whatever the latest and greatest standards are. The second one is recognition of prior learning, and that's where someone doesn't already hold the certificate, but they're able to give you enough evidence to confirm that they hold the knowledge and skills. So they may have been in a workplace doing, the tasks required for the unit of competency all their life, and therefore they're subject matter experts in the topic and can give you evidence that would confirm that. So that would be things like the CV showing where they've worked, what sort of work environments they've worked in. It might be a portfolio of different evidence that they can show you of their work that they have done. It could be third-party report from someone who knows them very well and has worked with them and can attest to the skills and knowledge that they already hold. So recognition of prior learning is all about, and recognition of current competency is all about what people hold historically. So you're not making them do the assessment from scratch. You're just asking them to give you evidence that they hold the skills and knowledge. It is possible, though, that if you've got a candidate who attests to the fact that they hold the skills and knowledge already, but they can't round up sufficient evidence, so they may not have been good record keeping, or it was privacy restricted or something like that, you may elect to have them proceed straight to just completing the full assessment activities. So they can skip the bit about having to learn the content and just go straight to the assessment itself. So that's another assessment-only pathways. But the main two ones are RCC and RPL, is what we call those ones. So now we get into the nitty-gritty of our principles of assessment, and this is really the backbone of making sure that you have a quality assessment process happening. So there are 4 principles under principles of assessment, and shortly we're going to talk about 4 separate rules of evidence. So they're different lists, they're 2 lists of 4, and one of the principles is kind of repeated in the rules of evidence as well. But this is how someone can look at an assessment tool. So that's everything related to the assessment process, all the instruments and all the instructions and all the marking guides and all those things we've just talked about. They can look at that and say that your assessment is valid. So that means that your assessment is fit for purpose. So you have gone out of your way to really make sure that the evidence that you're asking the candidate to perform, that you would watch or they would conduct knowledge requirements around, make sure that they can perform whatever the task is across a broad range of skills and knowledge and different environments. So it's making sure that you don't just assess them too narrowly so that they can only do it one way. And then when they get out into the real world, they find that they don't have a broad range of the required skills and knowledge, but they can do it in a certain way. So to make sure that you incorporate requirements into your assessment practice that meet this principle of validity, you do a process called mapping, and that's really just saying, okay, here's a list of all those assessment requirements, all those non-negotiable standards we have to meet, plus the assessment requirements for knowledge and evidence and the assessment conditions, and you have a little tick sheet that says where in your assessment instruments has this been covered. So that just makes sure that you're covering everything that you have to cover, and also that you have a variety of assessment methods, and particularly making sure those dimensions of competency are incorporated. So you would never just do one assessment task or assessment process to confirm that someone has a valid assessment, and it would not show that they were competent if all you did was give them a knowledge test, but you didn't ask them to show you how to do the task. And it would not be a valid assessment if the unit of competency says they've got to repeat something 5 times and you only get them to do it twice. So all of those little detail requirements are what go to make up this validity principle. And it's really just making sure that it's fit for purpose for the workplace and that it covers absolutely everything that is needed according to the unit of competency. The next principle is called reliability, and that's really just making sure that your assessment is consistent so that you don't have to guess what competence looks like when you're marking someone's results. So if you've ever had to mark a knowledge test, for example, and you haven't been given the model answers or what you're expecting in terms of behaviours in an observation, then you'll know how hard it is to say, well, did they really meet the mark or not? Because you don't have clarity around what your expectation is. That's also going to be a problem for the candidate or the learner because they won't know what you're wanting to see as well when it comes to demonstrating competence. So reliability is making sure that you've got really good quality marking guides, really good quality instructions, and that you then have a quality check process that happens to make sure that there is consistency of marking, particularly where you've got multiple assessors involved. So validation is a process which occurs in a 5-year cycle for every training product that the RTO has on scope, and it basically just asks a whole lot of questions about the quality of the tools to make sure that fresh eyes look at them to say, yes, this is the best way to do this assessment. And then they also look at actual marked assessments of students. So they will go through and pull out a statistically valid sample, and they will then get a random selection from that sample of students that have been marked, particularly by different assessors, and then they'll compare that you haven't got one assessor marking too soft and one assessor marking a bit harder, so that you've got a really fair process in place for your candidates. The next principle is called flexibility, and that's making sure that you don't just have a very fixed cookie-cutter approach to how you do your assessment that says, okay, you can only be assessed this way and no other way. That you really look at the different situation for particular learners and you adjust the assessment process determined on how it's best for that learner to demonstrate that they are able to show you that they are competent. So an example of this might be if you've got brand new learners to a topic, so you've got people that have just finished school and they haven't really had a lot of experience in the topic that you're teaching, you would probably have a longer program and you would probably do individual unit of competency learning and assessment. Versus someone where they might be working in the industry already, they've obviously got a certain amount of skills and knowledge before they even start the program. You might then do a clustered approach to the assessment of that learner group. So they would probably be able to cope with taking less time in their training program in the assessment, the associated assessment, and you might do clustered assessment, which is more efficient. And then you might have someone who already holds the skills and knowledge and just needs the certification, and you might assess them through RPL. So even though it can be the exact same qualification, you may have different pathways that allow the learner to show you their competence through different methods. So if someone comes along and says, look, here's my portfolio, that would be a different method to someone who comes along and says, okay, I'm ready to just go straight to assessment, or someone who's doing the full process. So it's just making sure that you are not too structured and fixed in your assessment methods, that you can allow different methods for people who've got different circumstance around the ability to have their competencies assessed. And then finally, kind of following on from flexibility, is what we call fairness. And this is really about equal opportunity for individual learners to make sure that you do not discriminate in the assessment process. So if someone has challenges around LLN, for example, and writing may be their area where they need additional support, you might have a scribe who captures their verbal responses and writes it for them. Or you might have someone who has a vision impairment, so you might have an audio assessment process where they have to respond verbally to questions that you ask them orally. So we call that concept reasonable adjustments, and that really just means that whatever the assessment tool is that you've put together for the standard learner group, you are able to make an adjustment to that assessment tool. So either the process, the instructions, the support that's around that, or the actual instrument itself. So you might change a written test to a verbal test, provided it doesn't minimise the requirements of the assessment standards. So if it says that you have to, type a document, and someone has a disability that would stop them from typing a document, you can't necessarily enrol them in that sort of unit of competency, because you'd be setting them up to fail if they could not then conduct the assessment as per the assessment requirements. And also it would be not fair on them if you're setting them up to fail if they then are deemed competent and then they get in the workplace and whatever the challenge is restricts them being able to get a job in the real world anyway. So this could be things around physical or any type of learning challenges and things like that. So it just means that you take the standard assessment tool that you've put together and you make an adjustment to the process or the instructions or the actual assessment format itself. And that you also make sure that the candidate has been given all the information about the assessment process. So you don't want them to find out halfway through that they were supposed to provide a certain piece of equipment which they can't then produce, or have certain materials that they need to do their assessment. So either tell them at the beginning so that everyone can really make good informed decisions before they start the whole process, and make sure that they know that they are permitted to challenge any results they feel are not fair, and that they could be perhaps reassessed by another assessor or something like that. So really it's just making sure that the whole process does not discriminate against anybody under any circumstance whatsoever. And ASQA has good guidelines in place within the standards for RTOs. That means that RTOs must put their appeals process on their website, I think it is, and they must also provide all this information at the beginning before someone actually makes a decision to enrol in a program. Okay, so just to recap on this reasonable adjustments part and show you some examples of that, it's really about the assessment process, environment and practices may be adjusted in negotiation with the candidate just to make sure that they are not disadvantaged. So their individual needs are being catered for so they have an equal opportunity to demonstrate their competency. But it's so important that whatever adjustment you make does not diminish your ability to collect all the evidence required as per the requirements of the unit. So you can't just make it easy for them and then not have them meet all the requirements of the unit, because then they would not have a valid outcome or valid assessment process and they would not be competent. And then that would not serve them well when they go to be in the real world of the actual vocation that you're assessing them for. So some examples of what different things could be done. You might give them some additional study support. So you might have a bit of one-on-one support provided perhaps you might help them with a supplementary LLN program that could help them brush up those skills. You might need to have different equipment or resources for certain learners. So if you've got students where they've identified dyslexia as a challenge, you might print the materials with larger font, or you might have it on certain coloured paper, so something that's going to really support them. You might have support teachers or specialist scribes or interpreters or something like that. And you might have flexibility around the scheduling and delivery of the training and assessment. This is a big one, where people are working, and if you're too fixed about the way the assessment has to happen, so it must be on this day and this day only, that's not really giving a fair opportunity for your candidates as well. And it's also got their provision of learning materials in alternative formats. So you might change your materials to be very image-based with lots of pictures of things rather than lots of text. So there's really no complete list of all these different support services. It's really about thinking about your individual learner and then considering how you can best support them with a reasonable adjustment. So our next area of theory is around the rules of evidence. So previously we talked about the principles of assessment, so that relates to the entire process. The rules of evidence just relates to the individual evidence items that you gather up to form your competency decision. So an example of that is your observation checklist or your knowledge test or your portfolio or your third party. So each of those are different pieces of evidence. And when you are using different evidence, you must ensure that they meet these rules of evidence. So validity is the first one. Again, it's a repeat word, and it means that whatever the evidence is, it must relate directly to the unit of competency. So if someone gives you something in a portfolio that's got nothing to do with the topic, then you can just exclude it up front. So it must make sure that you have enough of this evidence that relates directly to the unit of competency. So to make sure that we're incorporating that rule, we would map all of our evidence items to make sure that we have covered all of the unit components around performance criteria, performance evidence, knowledge evidence, and assessment conditions as they're laid out in the unit of competency. Sufficiency is just making sure you have enough. So it's also got to be of the right quality, and it's got to be showing that people can complete their tasks in a broad sense, so not just in one individual circumstance, that you have assessed them across those dimensions of competency so they are able to problem solve when things don't go to plan and they can complete a task end to end. So your sufficiency is making sure that you have enough, and normally around how you would incorporate sufficiency is again to map your evidence to show you've got a variety of evidence, and ideally that evidence could be collected over a period of time, not just one day where they could just fluke it, and that you incorporate industry engagement to make sure that the assessment process and the evidence collection items are relevant, that they are really going to support what needs to happen within a workplace. Then you've got authenticity, so that's just making sure that it's the candidate's own work. So you have to have checks and measures in place to confirm that. So if you're doing a distance training, you need to make sure that it's not someone's second cousin who's doing the assessment work for them. So the sorts of checks and measures that you could incorporate is a stat deck. So at the beginning, making sure they're very, very aware that it's got to be their own work and they're signing off their life away to say that it will be. That you collect direct evidence, which is where you're specifically involved in the assessment itself. So you watch them do something, you oversee them completing a test, where you really incorporate something that gives you good certainty that it's their own work. That you verify things like third-party reports. So you might ring and speak to the person who's signed off saying, yes, I know they hold the skills, or you verify any other evidence source. So just because someone presents a certificate or a qualification they're already holding do not assume that it's legit. You have to always verify it back at the source. Now, these days, that's quite easy to do with the USI in place. If they obtained it since that began life in 2015, you can get them to just download a transcript from their USI portal login, which will show you 100% confirmation that they did complete that certificate, or you may have to go to the originating RTO to confirm that as well. And then finally, we've got currency, which is making sure that the evidence you collect shows they hold the skills today. So if someone gives you a certificate or a qualification they achieved 10 years ago, it doesn't show that they still have kept their skills current. So you would need supplementary evidence to go with that certificate to say, here's how I've kept current. I've worked in the industry for the last 10 years. I've got this third-party evidence, or I've got my job description of the job I'm doing now, or here's a performance review that was completed last month showing, my abilities and things like that. So it's really just making sure that you as the assessor can hand on heart say that person holds the skills today, and even though they may have given you evidence that relates to the past, you would have to supplement that with additional verification to say that they hold the skills and knowledge today. So then we might drill down a little bit into the topic of how do we contextualise. So we mentioned earlier that contextualisation is really about making sure that your assessment is not too generic, that you have really customised it to fit with whatever the environment is that you're going to be having the candidate part of, so that there is no real need for an assessor to interpret what you're looking for when it comes to the assessment side of things. So I've just put a performance criteria, just one element from a unit called CUA DAN 101, Develop Foundation Dance Techniques. So the first element says identify different dance styles, and then you've got 4 different performance criteria that would lead you, upon satisfactory completion of those through some sort of assessment process, to know whether or not someone could identify different dance styles. So the first one is about discussing aspects of dance styles with relevant personnel. The next one's identifying and using safe dance practices. Then you've got discussing cultural protocols to be observed when performing cultural dance styles. And the fourth one is using dance terminology correctly in those discussions around different dance styles. So you have to really drill down into a unit of competency to ask questions that lead you to know exactly what the expectation is when someone is performing this particular element correctly. So you might look at the performance criteria and talk about, what dance style are you going to assess? So there's probably an unlimited list of different dance styles. So you need to really lock down which of the dance styles you would want to observe someone discussing with relevant personnel. So if you just said on your observation checklist, for example, observed candidate discussing dance styles with relevant personnel, anyone who's using that assessment instrument, so that observation checklist to observe someone, won't know what sort of dance styles they're wanting to see being discussed. And they would probably want to know what those aspects were. So for a different dance style, you may have different aspects of things that would be discussed that would let you know that someone was across that topic. So these are the sorts of questions that you have to ask when you are interpreting a unit of competency to make sure the context has been identified. So the next one was what safe dance practices should be identified and used, and what cultural dance style are you going to assess about those protocols. So again, the unit of competency will be totally vague. It will just be a generic statement. It won't tell you what the different cultural protocols are. So you have to apply them. So that will be related to the dance style, I would imagine. Not being a dancer myself, but I'd imagine that you would have to, in your assessment process, you would say, we're going to follow, Irish dancing, for example, and there would be therefore certain cultural dance styles that would be associated with that particular dance style. And then once the context has been determined, so what's the dance style and what's the different protocols around culture, then you would have to look at what terminology you would expect that a candidate who's competent in that particular dance style and cultural protocols, what sort of terminology should they be aware of to use in discussions. So you may have a different list of terminology depending on what the dance style is. So it really is about pulling apart the unit of competency to picture it happening in the workplace, the particular workplace that you want it to happen in. So when it's something that's very vague by just saying dance styles and not specifying what that is, you as the person writing the assessment tool can make the decision as to what dance style you choose, unless the unit says it must be this one, and this one. So in which case you would have to follow it based on the instructions in the actual unit itself. So when we put together an assessment tool, it normally has some standard components. So for the assessment part of this unit, there is a requirement to complete 3 assessment tools based on full assessment. And those assessment tools will have a few different parts to them. So firstly, there'll be an assessment plan, and that's where you're going to it's usually a single page document that just gives a high level overview of your intentions around assessment. So who's your target learner? Where is the assessment going to happen? What assessment methods are you going to use? What are the instruments that you would have to create as evidence to put together to make that decision? So you might say, well, this is a group of school leavers who are commencing a pre-employment program with a view to working in the dance industry or whatever industry it might be. Therefore, I would need to provide the following support for them, perhaps that they may have some special needs, and I'm going to assess them through a observation checklist and a knowledge test. And, you know, I would need the following equipment. So it's really everything to do with your pre-thinking about the assessment process itself, just so that if anybody else wants to understand what's in your mind, they can just pick up the assessment plan and know for sure what the intentions are. Then you'll have to produce the actual assessment instruments. Now for the TAE ASS 401 unit, you are also able to adjust existing materials. So instead of writing from scratch, you can sometimes find materials that you have been using perhaps for a certain in a certain environment, and you can adjust them. But we would require a minimum of 2 instruments. So a knowledge quiz is normally the easiest way to assess knowledge, and maybe an observation checklist or a project or something like that. And then we'll be doing a process called mapping, and that's where we do that cross-check to make sure that we have covered absolutely everything as required within the unit, and that we have sufficient evidence, and that we are covering those dimensions of competency by making sure that our assessment is going to cover all different kind of requirements within the unit. And then we'll be doing a quality review, which is a validation, and that's really just saying, is this tool fit for purpose and can it be released? It can also occur after you've done a trial using the assessment tool. So you might, as part of your TAE, have to conduct some actual assessment on candidates, and that would mean that you could do your quality review after that and just check whether or not they could be improved in any way. Just also mentioning that of those 3 full assessment tools to be created, one of them has to include support strategies for a candidate or candidates with a special need. So if you do a hypothetical assessment plan based on, for example, school leavers that may have learning difficulties, or there could be some other particular special need that you want to identify as a hypothetical, then you would just need to put the details of how you intend to support that student. So you might change a written test to a verbal knowledge quiz or something like that. And then your assessment instruments need to reflect that adjustment. Secondary to that is the RPL assessment process. So again, an assessment plan needs to be prepared, and that would just say that your target learner would be someone who already holds the skills and knowledge, and that it would be assessed through the process of recognition of prior learning. there's a requirement to then produce the instrument, the RPL kit, we call it, to collect the evidence related to sufficient evidence supporting that candidate's claim of competency. And you would conduct an actual evidence review on 2 candidates and then conduct a review at the end of that. So that's really the assessment that supports your ability to put together a plan and put together your assessment tools. So then when it comes to assessing competency, so you've actually put your assessment tool together, you've given it to someone else to kind of have some fresh eyes to look at it, then you need to actually conduct the assessment. So we've just distilled this down into 7 steps, and it really just says that you make sure that you review the assessment plan. So you are really, really clear on what is going on when, what equipment you need, what's the timing of it, any of those sort of logistical details, what's the reporting requirements. So all of that will be in the assessment plan. So prior to commencing your assessment, you make sure that you're really across what's in the assessment plan. And then you make sure that your candidate is really clear about what the expectation is of them. So you make sure that they are 100% happy with what they are going to be asked to do. So, you know, is it a knowledge test? Is it a task? Is it a role play? Whatever it might be, you make sure that the instructions to them are very, very clear and accurate. And you should also ask if they feel ready to be part of the assessment process. So some people may prefer to have a bit longer to do some practice runs even. So certainly being flexible and fair, you could accommodate that perhaps. Then you go ahead and conduct the assessment by gathering your valid, sufficient, current, authentic evidence. So making sure the evidence is directly related to the unit of competency, that you've got enough of it, that it shows the candidate holds their skills today, and that it is their own work. So as long as your evidence that you bunch up meets those rules of evidence, and then you make your decision. And the decision, as we mentioned earlier, will be just a competent versus not yet competent decision. So each of your individual evidence items, they may be marked individually. So it's not usual that you would do all the assessing on one day. It would normally be over a period of time. So you might do the knowledge test today, and then you might have the candidate come back after they've practiced their actual skills for a period of time, and then you would do the observation. So each of those individual evidence items are normally marked off with a satisfactory or not satisfactory outcome. So satisfactory is different to competent. Competent, you can only make a competent decision once you've got all the evidence together. So the individual evidence items can only be marked as satisfactory. You've met the standard for that one piece of evidence. But then when you put all the evidence together, that's what gives you sufficient information to be able to make a competent decision. So if someone is not yet competent, it just means that they need to complete something additionally to then demonstrate that they are competent. So if someone doesn't get all of their knowledge questions right, you would mark the knowledge test as not satisfactory. You would give them feedback about what the gaps are that they would need to fulfill, and they would do a resubmission. And then you would mark it again, and hopefully that would then become a satisfactory result. But until such point as you have all of your evidence completed to a satisfactory level, you can't make a competent decision. So it would still be sitting at not yet competent until such time as you had all the evidence to a satisfactory level. Very important that you give feedback to the candidate regarding the process and outcomes, and that you also identify in an evidence-based way what the gap is. So don't just say, look, I didn't like what you did. You've got to be very clear about what it is that hasn't met that benchmark. And it will, if you've got quality assessment instruments, then that should be nice and easy to do. But you should also ask them for their feedback about the assessment process. So how did it work for them? Was it clear? Did you give good instructions? Were they given enough time? all that sort of feedback is really important to collect from your learners to make sure that if there is potential for improvement, that you've got some factual evidence that you can take to a validation meeting to then make those improvements. Finally, you need to make sure that you document and report all assessment outcomes. And the RTO world is quite governed by legislation around making sure that record keeping is very secure and private, and that that you make sure every I is dotted and T's are crossed, because all of these assessment instruments are legal documents. So you are basically hand on heart signing off someone as being competent in a legal framework. So if, God forbid, something might happen down the track where there was an incident in a workplace, quite often it's a common practice for it to be traced back to when training occurred about a particular incident and who signed it off and how was all that happening. So definitely very important to make sure that all your record keeping is in accordance with the policies and procedures of the RTO, and they will have very specific procedures about whether they want assessment materials once they've been marked and feedback's been given, whether they want them submitted electronically or in hard copy, or what they require. And then finally, always a good plan to review how the process went. So were there any areas that you would improve? Say, for example, if you've got, a knowledge test with 20 questions, and every time you administer that test, the students say, look, I don't understand question 3. And if that's consistent across all the majority of the students, then you know that you should probably rewrite the wording around question 3 because it's not clear. And people may need to interpret the question and therefore might come up with the wrong answer. And it's not being a very fair assessment if there's something that's not really clear and straightforward for a candidate to complete their assessment work with. So that's really our steps for assessing competency. And then just to highlight some of the legislation related to assessment, obviously there's the standards for RTOs which talk about making sure the high quality assessment practice occurs. Unfortunately, in audit results, so when ASQA goes out and audits RTOs, the process of assessment is one of the highest areas of non-compliance. Largely, I think in a lot of cases because of those principles of assessment not being followed. So assessment tools don't accurately reflect all requirements of the unit, or there is inconsistency around the quality of the benchmarks and the model marking guides and things like that. So make sure that if you are working for an RTO where you are required to do assessment, if you can see any areas for improvement, that you do table it for during the validation process to make sure that the materials are the best they can be. Obviously, the Copyright Act is important because you can't just, take someone else's assessment materials and use those. You must make sure that they are owned by the RTO as their own intellectual property, or they have a license or subscription to use under permission of the creator. The Privacy Act is a very important one, that the results of individual candidates must not be shared with others, so only those within the RTO who are involved in the assessment process or the administration of the results are involved, and also that the enrolment information relating to any special needs, etc., or any details at all to do with the candidate are not shared with others. And obviously WHS goes without saying, so whenever any assessment activity is occurring, the students are under your care to make sure that they are in a safe environment, and the assessment activity, you've done a bit of a risk assessment prior to make sure there's no issues around safety at all with that. And finally, there can often be changes to training packages which will have flow-on effects to the assessment tool, that it would need to be rewritten or jigged or gap changed. Sometimes they're little changes, sometimes they're big changes. So just to be sure that all this information about any potential changes that you can keep on top of those. So before the change actually happens on the industry reference committee or the skills service organisation websites, they always have project pages saying these are the different projects that we're currently working on. So you can always see ahead of time what changes are likely to be coming down the chute. And then once it's been actually endorsed, so that means once it's gone live to say this is now the new version, then you will find it on training.gov.au, and you can set up a notification function on training.gov where you will be sent an email as a change occurs. So if a new training package is released, you get an email the day of that happening. They also have a couple of interesting tools on training.gov. The first one is a comparison tool, and this is where you can get a side-by-side view of what the differences are. So you can request, show me this unit of competency that's now superseded versus the newer version, and what are the differences. So that's the compare tool, which is found within the unit page on training.gov. And also there are companion volumes, which is an implementation guide, also found on the training package page, that will give details about what the suggestions are for implementation, the summary of the changes. They often can sometimes have details about credit arrangements. So if you've got people transitioning, so they're in the middle of completing a qualification when a training package changes, sometimes the SSO will give you a guideline about how to transition people across to the new one. Gosh, so that's a lot of information about planning assessment activities and assessing competence. Thank you for your time today, and certainly please refer to your additional learning materials for lots of other information supporting the content that we've gone through today. All the best. Thank you.